This is Robert Kaplan from the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. This is a podcast series about great power rivalry in an age of global demons.
If Russia continues to interfere with our democracy, I'm prepared to take further actions to respond.
Cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion.
The United States does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength.
How will conflicts between the United States and China and between the United States and Russia interact with pandemics, climate change, massive cyber attacks, state failures, and other terrors of a global media age? Stay tuned for a giveaway of my most recent book, The Good American, The Epic Life of Bob Gersony, the U.S. government's greatest humanitarian. With me is my guest, Elbridge Colby. Like all the guests I'm going to have on this podcast series, Elbridge Colby is someone who is not famous, but who should be. Elbridge is, I should say, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. He's a former colleague of mine at the Center for a New American Security. And Bridge also helped authored the National Defense Strategy under then Secretary of Defense James N. Mattis. So welcome, Bridge.
Great, Bob. Thanks very much. Delighted to be on with such a great friend and tremendous thinker. At least I'm not infamous. This is the good thing.
Yes, that's right. You may not be famous, but exactly. You're not infamous. All right, let's start with basics. Define the China threat. Why should the average American outside of the policy elite care about the challenge that China presents at this time in history?
Well, I think you put your finger on it. It's actually what I'm thinking about a lot right now, and I'm going to be working on for probably the next couple of years. And I think the common discussion often misdiagnoses it, as I think you and I put in our foreign affairs piece last fall, the ideology delusion. I think the quote unquote ordinary Americans will be and already have been very directly and adversely affected by the rise of China. And this is sort of, you don't need to take it from me. I mean, you can see in their behavior. But the fundamental reasons are not because it's a Marxist-Leninist dictatorship. That makes it worse. But the fundamental reason is basic great power incentives, structural incentives, which I think are geoeconomic, if you will, that China has a very powerful incentive to create a dominant market area, likely in Asia, given its size of the economy there and its regional proximity. And then from there to direct the favorable economic flows in its direction. And this is already what it's doing through the Made in China 2025 program and any number of 5-year plans and so forth. We've already seen it with deindustrialization. That would only continue so that the heights of the global economy would move to China and reflect Beijing and China's preferences, not our own. And that would have an immediate impact on our prosperity, but ultimately on our freedoms and even our security, because China would use that leverage in the way that it's using it now against Australia. It has used it against Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, South Korea, Vietnam, you name it, India, to affect our own lives. And I mean, frankly, they're already doing it. Look at how they behave towards the NBA and Disney. And those are just little tastes of the future if we allow China to become dominant in Asia.
Yes, and I should add that it isn't just East Asia, because China's Belt and Road Initiative is building roads, railways, pipelines, and better cyber connections across all of Eurasia to Europe and across the Indian Ocean all the way up the Red Sea and into the central Mediterranean. China will have a network of ports in Europe, Duisburg in Germany, a riverine port, Trieste, Piraeus in the Eastern Mediterranean that will link up through all that China is doing in the Middle East in terms of infrastructure with what you outlined. So we're talking about a Eurasian power, an Afro-Eurasian world island power, as Halford Mackinder put it over 100 years ago.
Yeah, I think you're right to stress the global aspect. Sometimes I get criticisms for this point. My point is not that China doesn't have global ambitions. It does. But that in order to achieve that, it first needs to establish dominance in its own area, which is the largest market area in the world. And from that position atop over half of global GDP, it will be globally preeminent. So while it is a global challenge, we really do need to focus on Asia, in my view. I'm a regionalist on that point.
All right, on Asia, years ago, I actually think the first person who used this analogy was Paul Wolfowitz, who, again, before the Iraq War, was a great Asia hand for many years. And Paul Wolfowitz called Taiwan Asia's West Berlin, this bulwark of freedom, of prosperity, of dynamism, yet threatened by this overbearing China, in the same way during the Cold War that West Berlin was an outpost of freedom, threatened all around by a Soviet-occupied East Germany and all. How do we defend Taiwan? Is it possible to defend Taiwan?
Sure. Well, just briefly, I would actually say it may even be more important than West Berlin, because while Taiwan, like West Berlin, is a symbol of our credibility, and to the extent that it matters for people of freedom in the world as part of our foreign policy, obviously it matters for the people on Taiwan. It's also militarily significant, which West Berlin was not. West Berlin was an insanity from a military point of view, but it was extremely important for our credibility and as a political symbol. Taiwan is important because it's right there in the middle of the first island chain. I like to point out that it's not a coincidence, to quote our Marxist friends, that Japan's first imperial venture under the Meiji period was to the island of Formosa, because it is the southern end of the Japanese archipelago. And of course, Japan is the most important ally we have in the world, and particularly in Asia, because of its strength and location and economic vitality. So is Taiwan defensible? Well, I wrote something about this in the Wall Street Journal last month, which people might find of interest. Yes, I believe it is. It's very, very difficult to do, but it can be done. And I think people like David Ochmanek of the RAND Corporation, or like Bob Work from CNAS, have put this well. I mean, I think the fundamentals here are, what's our standard? And I have a book coming out in the fall from Yale University Press, The Strategy of Denial, that goes into this quite a bit, as you know, Bob. But basically, look, Taiwan needs to hold out. And I think the people on Taiwan do not want to fall under Xi Jinping and the CCP's boot. And I think they've seen how credible the pledges of Beijing are in Hong Kong and many other instances. And it's very difficult. I mean, the PLA is an incredibly formidable force, and it is continuing to advance. But fundamentally, they need to project military power across about 100 nautical miles of water and sustain operations. Now, there's nothing harder in the military domain, or few things as hard as an amphibious operation in the face of a prepared defense. Now, I emphasize a prepared defense.
Right, yeah. As John Mearsheimer put it, the stopping power of water.
Exactly. And another of our favorites, Nicholas Spikeman, actually made this point in an earlier era. And of course, I actually found a good quote from Hugh Dowding, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding from 1940, which is, basically the British saying, look, the Nazis have a harder problem, even though they dominated Europe at the time. This is doable. I mean, basically what we know we need to do, we need to have an effective, what's called C4ISR architecture, resilient C4ISR architecture. Basically, the eyes, ears, and nervous system to be able to see what's going on and target rapidly. We need the forces postured and armed with the right munitions to basically sink. I mean, it's a little bit simplistic, but it gets to the point. Several hundred PLA Navy vessels before they can disgorge their forces and sustain them on the island of Taiwan, and shoot down enough PLA aircraft. If we can achieve that, then we're in a decent place. At that point, the Chinese can continue their bombardment or blockade of Taiwan, maybe, although blockade would be difficult to sustain in the face of concerted opposition by the United States and others, which I think we should prepare for. But it is a feasible and tractable problem. And this is, common sense. Don't get involved in a land war in Asia. Well, the obverse of that is America's in a pretty good position if it's fighting a sea war in Asia. That plays to our strengths. Now, the point here is, and this is what we were trying to do with the National Defense Strategy, building on the work of people like Bob and Dave, to shift the Defense Department's efforts towards what I like to call a denial defense for Taiwan. We've made progress, but we need to do more and do it rapidly. And Taiwan needs to do a lot more. That's another critical point. So it is feasible, but we need focus, and we need to be prepared to do less elsewhere.
Is it a binary choice? Is it we defend Taiwan, we sell and give to Taiwan literally everything it needs to make a mainland Chinese attack on Taiwan unproductive or too high a cost?
I think it is a binary choice. I don't think it's a real option anymore to supply Taiwan as a viable defense option. I mean, I think there are certain circles where there's a lot of optimism in smaller powers' ability to turn what's called this anti-access area denial structure against aggressive powers. But I just ask you to look at what happened to Iraq in 1990, 1991, one of the most formidable militaries on paper in the world, completely dismantled by the United States. Obviously, we're a generation later, but the point holds, which is that a state with the sophistication and scale of the PLA, using cyber, using precision strike, using any number of other tools, it will just overwhelm Taiwan and will be able to weather whatever they have to show for it. So it is really for us, primarily the United States. I think there would be an important role for Japan in a variety of ways, and you've seen increasing signals from Tokyo on that.
Japan is interesting. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, Bridge and I will discuss our European allies and their relationship to our adversaries. You won't hear these insights anywhere else. Stay tuned.
This podcast is sponsored by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. Founded in 1955, FPRI is committed to producing the highest quality scholarship and expert analysis through the lens of history, geography, and culture. For more information about FPRI and our work to educate the public on the most pressing foreign policy issues of the day, please visit www.fpri.org.
Japan is interesting because, look, I agree with you that Japan is America's most important ally because Germany has become neutral. It'll be getting more and more subsidized natural gas from Russia. China will soon, in the foreseeable future, be Germany's biggest trading partner. And Germans will be playing one power off against the other to the degree that the Japanese will not. Because China is Japan's biggest trading partner, but Japan is not getting energy from Russia and takes its military far more seriously than Germany does.
Well, I've got apologies for keep referencing it, but just if people are interested, but I have a piece coming out for Jacob at the National Interest about, kind of along these lines. I've gone through the stages of grief on Germany. I've been angry, I've been despondent, I've been, everything. And now I'm sort of resigned. And I think people like us look at it through a geopolitical lens, and it's not surprising. Japan is with us so much because they are very acutely and directly threatened by China, both by proximity and because Japan is the natural target for China. The reason that we're so close with Japan and India are they the two second-tier powers. And so if you go back to Sam Huntington, it's a natural alignment. Germany feels the threat much less acutely. And my view is that I haven't given up on Germany, but I think they face a choice. I think we should ask kind of less of them in terms of overt and this is where I think the Biden administration seems to be off course, is kind of trying to make this league of global democracies as if it's the ideological alignment that will power that security and strategic alignment. I think we should ask less of Germany, in particular, taking a much more leading role in security in its own neighborhood, because we won't have a military with the size to fight in two theaters. And frankly, even if a war breaks out in Europe, we need to protect our ability to defeat China and Asia over Taiwan. So that's going to really tie our hands. So the Europeans really need to take a much more leading role. I think where we need to push Germany is really on the economic scale. And this is where the comprehensive agreement on investment is really, I hate to say a stab in the back, but it's a slap in the face at a minimum. And we'll see how that goes. But with the Portuguese, as you and I both have exposure, they're taking over the European Council, I think, and that's, they're close to the Chinese.
Yes, as long as we've oscillated back and forth between Europe and Asia, let me ask this question. What was the national defense strategy that you wrote? What does it mean? Why is it important?
Sure. Well, thanks. I think, Secretary Mattis promulgated this national defense strategy in early 2018. And what I would describe it as is a very clear strategic framework that prioritizes China above all, followed by Russia, and then puts the other three challenges, transnational terrorism, Iran, North Korea, in a tertiary position. It also, what it did was it called for a focus on warfighting rather than presence operations, which is to be able to, defeat in a plausible contingency particularly a fait accompli, and the department, that term was not used in the National Defense Strategy, but it is being used by the department as an outgrowth of it now. The Indo-Pacific Strategy referred to it from the Department of Defense. And it also, I think, distinctively, it made hard calls. It said what the department should do less of. And that's very important as a political signal. So I think a strategy like the National Defense Strategy, I mean, to immodestly paraphrase Dean Ashton, is designed to beat down the mass mind of government a little bit. It's not a master plan. In my view, it's a strategic framework. It says, if you're in the defense establishment, you should probably be working on China and preparing to beat China in a war. And if you're not, you better have a pretty good excuse for it. And you need to be doing it more efficiently and economically. And that it goes from employment of our forces to developing our future forces to working with our allies and partners to working on our technology to working in what's called the fourth estate, the back office functions. And, you know, I actually give the Department of Defense a lot of, I mean, I think they're doing pretty well. I mean, it's a cottage industry to always say the Department of Defense is not doing enough and so forth. And, you know, anyone who's worked inside a bureaucracy knows what that's like. So I actually think the Department of Defense has done pretty well. And frankly, you know, our old colleague, Eli Ratner, is a fantastic thinker and person. He's leading this China team at the Pentagon. That's encouraging. So, you know, we'll see, but certainly need to hold them to account. But preliminary signals at least offer some reason
on
for
this
hope.
subject of the Pentagon bridge, we have a new defense secretary, Lloyd Austin, who is a big surprise. Nobody expected, you know, a few months ago, right after Biden was elected, it was assumed that they would appoint our former colleague, Michelle Flournoy. Michelle Flournoy is a known figure in terms of what she thinks about China, the Navy, naval strategy, all of that. Austin is from a big army background, mainly from the Middle East. So he's somewhat of an unknown. You know, he's like undeclared. What do you have any thoughts about him in reference to the Asia Pacific and China and naval strategy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a concern. And I said this publicly when he was announced. I mean, I think you and I are biased on Michelle Flournoy. Both we know her personally and admire and like her a lot. But also she has been clear on these issues. She had a very good foreign affairs piece last summer that made it clear, you know, just kind of the things I'm talking about in a Taiwan scenario and a fait accompli scenario. It was very good. I mean, I really had no beef with it on that point, at least. You know, as you say, Lloyd Austin Secretary Austin is an unknown quantity. And I mean, my first reaction was, why are we dealing with an unknown quantity when we're dealing with a generational, if not once in a century level challenge? I think, you know, I feel like we should be putting our experienced players on the field. Okay, he's Secretary of Defense. He's been confirmed. I think there's some of his subordinates are encouraging. You know, they seem, I mean, Kath Hicks, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, I don't always agree with her, but she's definitely locked onto these problems. She's experienced. But my concern is that the very senior levels, I mean, President Biden, Secretary Austin, they don't communicate, they don't telegraph to me a genuine appreciation for the severity and depth of the problem. Part of that's experience. You know, I mean, my understanding is Secretary Austin never served in the Pacific. So, but, you know, I mean, Secretary Mattis never served, didn't have much service, didn't have much experience, but he really got locked on. But Secretary Mattis had a public record, and he spent time out at Hoover with George Shultz and people like that, focused on the Pacific and broader geopolitical issues.
Also, Jim Mattis was a Marine general, which meant he was part of the naval force. And naval officers think more strategically, generally, than Army officers do. Also, Jim Mattis was a sui generis Shakespearean. Right. He was a real intellectual.
I mean, he's written books. He's sui generis. But so I don't know what Secretary Austin will do. But the point I'm making is, when push comes to shove, I mean, there are a lot of people in the Department of Defense who either formally or frankly informally won't listen to anybody other than the Secretary of Defense. And that person's got to be willing to make tough calls in favor, because especially in a Democratic administration where there's going to be downward pressure, at least on the real defense budget, there are going to have to be some sharp choices. And frankly, we're also going to have to push the allies to do more. And I see he's talking to the NATO ministers. I mean, certainly there are things that could be improved on President Trump's approach to how to deal with the Europeans. But going back to just being nice and basically telegraphing that we're not going to take these defense spending requests seriously is not the right way to go about it. So I'm hopeful. Yeah. We'll see.
We're going to take a short break. Stay tuned.
If you are enjoying the Global Demons podcast, you'll also enjoy Robert D. Kaplan's latest book, The Good American, a sweeping yet intimate story of the most influential humanitarian you've never heard of, Bob Gersony, who spent 4 decades in crisis zones around the world. Thanks to our sponsor, Random House, you can win a signed copy of The Good American just by listening to this podcast. All you have to do is subscribe to this podcast and leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We will have a random drawing and announce the winner on our 13th and final episode.
You know, in these big jobs, it often comes down to not even resume experience, but to just judgment at key moments. I mean, Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld had great resumes for their jobs, and yet they did not exude judgment at key moments. So I guess we have to hope that Austin will have good judgment during the crises to come. Another point that kind of dances around what you were talking about, the Navy. We keep coming back to the Navy. Because nuclear weapons are unusable in a certain sense, the Navy is our strategic instrument. So does a century or a decade or two ahead of rivalry with China, does that argue for a stronger Navy?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we all kind of know that we need to prioritize our maritime and also aerospace forces. I wouldn't underestimate the importance of the air and space forces, because while it's a maritime theater, there's a lot of air above it too, right? Just like so, I think everybody knows that it would be preferable for us to be able to make decisions that prioritized some of the services over the others. I mean, the legendary example is President Eisenhower prioritizing the Air Force back in the 50s. To General Milley's credit, he has indicated that he thinks it's more important to prioritize the Navy. So I don't know what's going to end up with this budget request, but we do need, and the Chinese are laying keels and tonnage like it's more than their job, like it's their hobby too. Our colleague and friend Tom Shugart, who's a senior adjunct fellow, retired Navy captain, very, very good, insightful guy, points this out all the time. And we pat ourselves in the back and say, well, our forces are much more qualitatively superior. And that's not necessarily true. Actually, another colleague of mine from the Pentagon, General Eric Wesley, who just retired, he pointed out in a War on the Rocks piece, in a few years, we're going to have nobody in the military who served during the Cold War, which is the last time people really focused on great power. They're going to shut off your lights and, peer to peer as opposed to a counterinsurgency. I'm not denigrating, of course, the Middle East, the service in the Middle East, but it's a very different kettle of fish. So to your point, I think absolutely. And we know we need more submarines. We need more long range strike. We need more to bring unmanned and autonomous systems into the mix. But the question is how.
All right, last question. You've really carved out a niche. Explain nuclear power, nuclear bombs, why we still need them. Why don't we just have no nuclear weapons at all? It would save a lot of money, not just producing them, but maintaining them, with all that entails, even in the military, let alone in domestic matters. So why do we need nuclear weapons still a third of a century after the Cold War? And is our nuclear posture the way it should be? And what are your concerns about President Biden on this score?
Nuclear weapons, they are largely unusable. I think actually in a major power war with China or Russia, they probably would become involved, which is one of the reasons people are so cautious about entering it. But I think it's pretty commonsensical, which is to say, if your potential opponent or your potential rival has something that would absolutely dominate you without question, and you don't have a good retort, you're going to be owned in any negotiation. And a war or a crisis is a form of negotiation. Everybody knows about negotiation. And, we live in if you're negotiating over a house, there's a structure of law that kind of confines that negotiation. But in a war, as you well know, there's no external force, particularly a war between great powers. There's no umpire. And so if one guy's got essentially a trump card and the other guy doesn't, then why wouldn't you use it? And of course, the example that we know of is World War II, where as soon as we had it ready, we used it. Because why wouldn't we use it to save hundreds of thousands of American lives, not to mention probably 1 million or more Japanese lives? So I think that's the sort of the basic intuitive kind of commonsensical level. And frankly, if we get into war, God forbid, with either the Chinese or the Russians, then, Jim Schlesinger had he said the nuclear weapons are like the big stick in the closet. Everybody knows they're there. You don't bring it out because it could escalate things more than you want. But if you haven't thought it through how they're going to be a part of it, it's not going to work. And so in my book, actually coming out in the fall, a lot of it's about the conventional stuff, but there's a whole big part of a chapter dedicated to, okay, well, what if we do beat China over, say, Taiwan? They're going to have an option to use nuclear weapons. So we better have our strategy figured out to deter them from doing that. Abolition is a pipe dream. It's never going to happen. And frankly, I'm not sure. I don't think I would really want to live in that world, because the only way it would work would be with a world government, in my view. And I don't want to live in a world with a world government.
Yeah, I think we conclude by saying that without nuclear weapons, you're more likely to have conventional war, because nuclear weapons made the Cold War peaceful in Central Europe. And so actual war was confined to the edges of the battlefield in the developing world, essentially. So the nuclear weapons kept the Cold War in Europe peaceful, in other words. And nuclear weapons may be doing something like that today. We just don't know, because we haven't been in an unnuclear world since 1945.
Well, I think you're right about the Cold War. I'm not sure it applies today for a couple reasons, and I go into this in the book. And actually, some of these, it's great to be on with FPRI, because I wrote about some of these things in Orbis years ago, and pleased to have a contribution in the most recent issue on the Europe issue with Ian Brzezinski, which was a pleasure. But I think, what's different now is two things. One, nuclear weapons are much less a part of the sort of battlefield, if you will, the perceptual battlefield. In Europe, in the 1970s or 1980s, there were literally tens of thousands of nuclear weapons at play, including many in Europe itself. I mean, the Soviets couldn't have barreled through the inter-German border essentially without triggering a large-scale tactical nuclear use, which would almost certainly have led to a strategic exchange. That's not true anymore. We don't have nuclear weapons forward deployed very much. We don't have our nuclear weapons as part of our standard operating procedure. One of my favorite anecdotes, in the second Taiwan Straits crises in the late 1950s, U.S. forces that would have defended Taiwan from a PRC attack could not have operated without the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Aircraft carriers, that's what they carried. That's what they practiced with. So if it was going to be a war, it was going to be a nuclear war. And that was by design for Eisenhower. That's not true today. So you can fight a conventional war. You can think it's possible. Now you have to reckon with the possibility of nuclear escalation. It's not automatic. And the second part that I think is a bit different is that I think the ideological piece is less salient. I mean, I think back to the 1950s and people saying better dead than red. My grandfather, my mother's father is kind of better dead than red. I don't think people feel it as acutely, to your first question about China, as they did then. And that might say to yourself, well, maybe we fight a conventional war, but we're not going to go nuclear. And so paradoxically, that makes a war more plausible, as you pointed out. I was going to point out, we live in a world that may be more dangerous in a sense than the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War had catastrophic civilizational consequences if it escalated. But we live in a world perhaps less catastrophic, but more likely to see great power conflict, great power military conflict. We'll end it there. I've been with Elbridge Colby, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, and I'm Robert D. Kaplan at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Thank you. Great, Bob. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Global Demons podcast, brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts and visit our website at www.fpri.org. For the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I'm Robert D. Kaplan.